The security guard's hand shot out to block Sarah Mitchell's path 3 feet from the mahogany door. She'd already passed through 2 checkpoints, surrendered her phone, and signed what felt like a dozen non-disclosure agreements. But apparently, that wasn't enough. "He's refused the last 4 therapists," the guard muttered, not meeting her eyes. Lasted maybe 10 minutes each before they quit. Sarah adjusted her medical bag and stepped around him. "I'm not the last 4 therapists." The door opened before she could knock. A man in an expensive suit that probably cost more than her monthly salary stood in the doorway, his dark hair perfectly styled despite the obvious tension radiating from every inch of his 6-foot frame. His left hand gripped the door handle while his right hung at his side, fingers slightly curled in a way that immediately caught her professional attention. "You're late," Michael Sterling said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had probably never been questioned in a boardroom. "Traffic was." "I don't care." He turned and walked away, leaving the door open behind him. Sarah followed him through a hallway lined with abstract paintings that looked like they belonged in a museum. The apartment was spotless, sterile, and felt more like a showroom than a home. No family photos, no personal touches, nothing that suggested an actual person lived here. "Mr. Kane said you were injured in an accident," she began, pulling out her tablet to review his limited medical file. Michael stopped abruptly and spun to face her. "Mr. Kane says a lot of things. What exactly did he tell you about this job?" The intensity in his gray eyes made her pause. Most of her clients were grateful for help, eager to regain function and mobility. This man looked like he wanted to throw her out the window. Nerve damage to the right hand, limited mobility, previous therapists were unsuccessful in establishing treatment protocols. She kept her voice professional, clinical. "He mentioned you were particular about your medical care." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "Particular? That's one word for it." He led her into what was clearly his home office, though it was larger than most people's living rooms. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Central Park, and the mahogany desk was covered with papers and multiple computer screens displaying financial data that shifted constantly. "I assume Kane explained the terms," Michael said, settling into his desk chair and pointedly not looking at her. 2 sessions. If you can't show measurable improvement, you're done. 2 sessions isn't enough time to. It's what the others got." Sarah set her bag down and pulled out a basic mobility assessment form. "I'll need to examine your hand to understand the extent of the damage." "No." The word came out so fast and sharp that she actually took a step back. His entire body had gone rigid, and his left hand was now gripping the edge of his desk hard enough that his knuckles were white. "Mr. Sterling, I can't help you if I can't assess the problem." "Then I guess you can't help me." For a moment, they stared at each other across the office. Sarah had worked with trauma patients before, people who'd been hurt badly enough that human touch had become associated with pain rather than healing. But this felt different. This felt like he was protecting something, not just avoiding discomfort. "What happened to your hand?" she asked quietly. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "Car accident. 15 years ago." 15 years? She couldn't hide her surprise. "You've had limited mobility for 15 years, and you're just now seeking treatment?" "I'm not seeking anything. Kane hired you without my consent." That explained the hostility, at least partially. But 15 years of avoiding treatment suggested something much deeper than simple reluctance. Sarah pulled up a chair and sat down, ignoring his obvious displeasure at her making herself comfortable. "Show me," she said. "I already told you. Not your hand. Show me what you can do with it." He stared at her for a long moment, then slowly lifted his right hand and placed it on the desk. His fingers moved sluggishly, like he was fighting against invisible resistance. He managed to make a loose fist, but when he tried to extend his fingers fully, 2 of them remained partially curled. "The thumb?" she asked. He demonstrated limited opposition, barely able to touch his thumb to his pinky finger. For someone who'd built a financial empire, the loss of fine motor control in his dominant hand must have been devastating. "You've adapted well," she observed. "Your left-hand compensation is remarkable. I don't need your professional admiration. You need something." Sarah leaned forward slightly. 15 years of avoiding treatment, 5 different therapists in the last month, and a lawyer hiring medical professionals without your consent. "What aren't you telling me about this accident?" Michael's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might actually answer. Then he stood up abruptly, effectively ending their first session. Your 2 sessions start tomorrow, he said, walking toward the door. Don't be late again. Sarah gathered her things slowly, studying the man who'd just dismissed her. Something about this case felt wrong, and it wasn't just his attitude. In 15 years, nerve damage didn't typically remain static. It either improved with proper treatment or deteriorated without it. As she reached the door, she turned back. Mr. Sterling? That scar on your wrist. It's not from nerve damage. He froze, his hand moving instinctively to cover the thin, white line she'd noticed during his demonstration. I'll see you tomorrow, she said, and left him standing there in his sterile, beautiful apartment, protecting secrets that were probably older than his injuries. Sarah spent the night researching Michael Sterling instead of sleeping. What she found filled 3 legal pads with notes and left her with more questions than answers. Sterling Industries had been a family business for 3 generations until 15 years ago, when a single-car accident had killed both of Michael's parents and left him the sole heir at 17. The official reports were sparse, clinical, and completely at odds with the man she'd met. According to Forbes, he'd transformed a struggling regional investment firm into a multinational powerhouse, but every photo from the last decade showed the same cold, distant expression she'd seen yesterday. More interesting was what the reports didn't say. No mention of friends, relationships, or any life outside his business empire. No charitable foundations, no social appearances, no indication that Michael Sterling existed anywhere except behind his desk. She arrived at his apartment 10 minutes early and found him waiting in the same office, wearing another suit that probably cost more than her car. This time, though, she noticed things she'd missed before. The way he positioned himself, so his right hand was always out of direct view. The slight hesitation before he reached for anything. The carefully controlled movements that suggested years of practice hiding his limitations. You're early, he said without looking up from his computer screens. I'm prepared. She set her bag down and pulled out a series of resistance bands and small weights. We're going to start with basic range of motion exercises. I told you I don't want. Mr. Sterling. She turned to face him fully. Yesterday you demonstrated functional movement in your hand. That tells me the nerve pathways aren't completely severed. With proper therapy, you could regain significant mobility. And if I'm not interested in regaining mobility? The question caught her off guard. In 5 years of practice, she'd never had a patient who didn't want to improve their condition. Why wouldn't you want to get better? Something flickered across his face too quickly for her to interpret. Maybe some things are better left alone. Sarah studied his expression, remembering the way he'd covered that scar when she mentioned it. She pulled out her tablet and opened a file she'd been avoiding since yesterday. Police photos from Claire's disappearance, images she'd memorized during countless sleepless nights over the past 15 years. Mr. Sterling, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. He finally looked up from his screens, and she saw wariness replace his usual irritation. 15 years ago, there was a car accident on Route 9A just outside the city. A teenage girl named Claire Mitchell disappeared that night. She watched his face carefully. Do you remember that accident? The change in him was immediate and dramatic. Every muscle in his body went rigid, and his left hand slowly curled into a fist on the desk. I don't know what you're talking about. The scar on your wrist. She kept her voice steady, professional. I've seen it before. In crime scene photos. Michael stood up so abruptly that his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. This session is over. The police reports mentioned a second vehicle, one that left the scene before emergency responders arrived. The investigating officer noted unusual glass fragments and paint transfer that suggested, "Get out." His voice was deadly quiet, but Sarah could see the tremor in his left hand, the only sign that his control was slipping. She'd hit something, and every instinct told her to push harder. Claire was my sister, she said quietly. The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Michael's face went completely blank, but she caught the sharp intake of breath, the way his eyes darted involuntarily to his right hand. Your sister is dead. Her body was never found. Because there wasn't enough left to find. The cruelty in his voice should have hurt, but Sarah had heard worse theories over the years. What struck her was the way he said it, like he was trying to convince himself as much as her. You were there, she said. That scar, the timing of your accident, the location. You were there when she disappeared. Michael walked to the window and stood with his back to her, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant hum of traffic from Central Park West. "If I was there," he said finally, "and your sister is gone, what exactly do you think happened?" The question was clearly meant to end the conversation, but something in his tone made her step closer. Not closer to him, but closer to the truth she'd been searching for since she was 12 years old. "I think you tried to help her," she said. "And I think whatever happened that night has been eating at you for 15 years. He turned around then, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. Pain, guilt, and something that might have been relief warred across his features before he locked them down again. "You have no idea what you're talking about. Then tell me what really happened." For a moment, she thought he might. His carefully constructed walls seemed to crack, just slightly, and she could see the 17-year-old boy who'd lost everything in a single night. Then his phone rang, shattering the moment. He answered it without taking his eyes off her, his voice returning to its usual cold professionalism. "Sterling, no, cancel it. I don't care what they want." He hung up and looked at her again, but whatever vulnerability she'd glimpsed was gone. "Tomorrow," he said. "One more session. Then you're done, and we never speak of this again." Sarah gathered her equipment slowly, her mind racing. She'd found the connection she'd been looking for, but now she wasn't sure she was prepared for what it might mean. "Mr. Sterling?" She paused at the door. "That night, were you alone in the car?" His silence was answer enough. Sarah's hands were still shaking when she reached her car. She sat in the parking garage beneath Sterling's building for 20 minutes, trying to process what had just happened. For 15 years, she'd imagined finding someone who knew what happened to Claire. She'd never imagined it would be like this. Her phone buzzed with a text from Richard Kane. "How did the session go?" She stared at the message, suddenly aware of how little she actually knew about the man who'd hired her. Kane had contacted her clinic directly, asking specifically for her by name, and offering triple her usual rate for what he'd called a challenging case. At the time, she'd assumed someone had recommended her work. Now she wondered how he'd even known she existed. Instead of responding, she drove to her clinic in the Bronx and spent the afternoon reviewing Kane's file. The law firm's address was real, his credentials checked out, and the payment had cleared immediately. But when she called the main number, the receptionist claimed no knowledge of any Richard Kane. That evening, she found herself parked outside Sterling's building again, watching the lights in his penthouse windows. She should have gone home, should have walked away from whatever this was becoming. Instead, she thought about the way Michael's voice had changed when he said Claire was dead, like the words physically hurt him. Her phone rang, startling her out of her thoughts. "Ms. Mitchell? This is James Crawford, head of security for Sterling Industries." The voice was professionally polite, but carried an underlying warning. "Mr. Sterling asked me to call you. Is everything okay? He's concerned about your personal interest in his case. He wanted to make sure you understand that any breach of confidentiality would have serious legal consequences." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I haven't breached anything. Of course not. But Mr. Sterling is a very private man, and he values that privacy highly. I'm sure you understand." The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at her phone. Michael had investigated her enough to get her personal number and felt threatened enough to have his security chief call her, which meant she was getting close to something he didn't want her to find. The next morning, she arrived at his apartment to find him waiting by the elevator, dressed in jeans and a sweater instead of his usual suit. The casual clothes made him look younger, more human, but his expression was as cold as ever. "We're working in the gym today," he said without preamble. He led her to a room she hadn't seen before, a fully equipped home gym with high-end machines and weights. Floor-to-ceiling mirrors covered one wall, and she caught herself checking her reflection before focusing on the professional reason she was there. "I want to try some functional exercises," she said, pulling resistance bands from her bag. "Activities that mimic daily tasks." "Fine." She demonstrated the first exercise, a simple, gripping motion designed to strengthen the muscles between his thumb and forefinger. When she moved to guide his hand into position, he jerked away so violently that she stumbled. "Don't." The word came out sharper than intended, and she saw him force himself to relax. "I need to guide you through the movement," she said carefully. "It's the only way to ensure proper form. Show me again." She demonstrated twice more, then watched him attempt the exercise. His movements were careful, controlled, but she could see the tremor in his fingers that suggested nerve damage far more complex than he'd admitted. "Mr. Sterling, when was the last time you had a comprehensive neurological evaluation?" "I don't see how that's relevant. Because what I'm seeing suggests more than simple trauma. There could be ongoing nerve compression, scar tissue interfering with function, any number of issues that could be addressed with proper treatment." He stopped mid-exercise and looked at her directly for the first time that morning. "And why do you care so much about my medical condition?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Sarah found herself studying his face, noticing details she'd tried to ignore. The strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead when he concentrated, the intelligence in his gray eyes that seemed to see everything. "Because it's my job," she said, but they both knew that wasn't the whole truth. Something shifted in the air between them, a tension that had nothing to do with missing sisters or mysterious lawyers. When he reached for the next resistance band, their fingers brushed, and neither of them pulled away immediately. "Your turn," he said quietly. "My turn for what?" "To answer a question." His voice had dropped to just above a whisper. "Richard Kane. How long have you known him?" Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "I don't know him. He contacted my clinic about treating you." "Try again." "That's the truth." Michael stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle that seemed to wrap around her. "I had Kane investigated last night. Interesting thing about lawyers who don't seem to exist in any meaningful way." "What are you talking about?" "No active cases, no court appearances in the last 2 years, no professional associations. Richard Kane is a name on a letterhead and nothing more." His eyes never left hers. "So I'll ask you again. Why are you really here?" Sarah's mouth went dry. She'd been played, manipulated into this situation by someone who didn't exist, for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. But looking at Michael, seeing the suspicion and hurt in his expression, she realized she'd lost something more important than professional credibility. "I don't know," she whispered. "I swear to you, I don't know." For a moment, she thought he might believe her. Then his phone buzzed with a text message, and whatever softness had crept into his expression vanished entirely. "Your session is over," he said, stepping back. "Don't come back." Sarah stood outside Michael's building for 3 hours before security finally escorted her out. She returned the next morning, then the next, until James Crawford personally informed her that she was no longer welcome on the property. She was sitting in her car across the street when Michael finally emerged on the 4th day. He walked towards Central Park with his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, and she found herself following him, staying far enough back to avoid his notice. He stopped at a bench overlooking the reservoir and sat down, staring out at the water. From her position behind a cluster of trees, Sarah could see his profile, the tension in his shoulders, the way his right hand rested carefully on his knee. She was debating whether to approach when her phone rang. "Stop following me." Michael's voice was tired rather than angry. Sarah looked around, trying to spot him, then realized he must have seen her reflection in the water. She walked slowly to the bench and sat down beside him, leaving space between them but close enough to talk. "I can't let this go," she said. "Because you think I killed your sister?" The bluntness of the question hit her like a physical blow. "No, because I think you're the only person who knows what really happened to her." Michael was quiet for a long time, watching joggers circle the path around the reservoir. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to lean closer to hear him. "She was 16, scared, running from something she wouldn't tell me about. I found her hitchhiking on Route 9A in the middle of a rainstorm." Sarah's breath caught. This was more than he'd ever admitted, more than she'd dared hope for. "I pulled over, told her to get in the car. She was soaked, shivering, kept looking over her shoulder like someone was following her." He paused, his left hand clenching and unclenching on the bench. "She said her name was Claire. She begged me not to call the police." "So you didn't?" "I was 17 and stupid. I thought I could handle whatever trouble she was in." His laugh was bitter, self-recriminating. "I was going to drive her to the bus station, give her some money, let her disappear if that's what she wanted." Sarah waited, afraid that any interruption would make him stop talking. "We never made it to the station. Another car came out of nowhere, forced us off the road. We rolled 3 times before hitting the guardrail." Michael's right hand moved unconsciously to his wrist, covering the scar she'd noticed. "When I came to, Claire was gone." "Gone how?" The passenger door was open. No body, no blood trail, nothing. Like she'd just vanished. He turned to look at Sarah directly for the first time. The police found me pinned under the steering wheel with a piece of metal through my wrist. They said there was no evidence anyone else had been in the car. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. But you told them about Claire. Of course I told them. They said I was confused from the head trauma, that I'd imagined the whole thing. The investigating officer suggested I was making up a story to cover for reckless driving. But you weren't. No, I wasn't. His voice carried 15 years of frustration and guilt. I've spent 15 years wondering if she crawled out of that car and died somewhere in the woods. If whoever was chasing her found her. If she was hurt, and I just left her there. Sarah reached out instinctively, covering his left hand with hers. The contact seemed to startle both of them, but neither pulled away. You were hurt too, she said softly. You couldn't have helped her if you were unconscious. I should have called the police the moment I saw her. Should have taken her to a hospital, a police station, anywhere but that goddamn road. His fingers turned under hers, almost but not quite intertwining. Instead, I let a scared kid disappear on my watch. They sat in silence, her hand still covering his, both of them staring out at the water. Sarah felt 15 years of anger and blame shifting inside her chest, rearranging themselves around this new information. You've been carrying this alone all this time, she said. I deserve to carry it. No. The word came out more forcefully than she'd intended. You were a kid too. You tried to help her. Michael turned toward her then, and she saw something vulnerable in his expression that made her heart skip. Your sister was brave, you know. Even scared and running, she was brave. How do you know? Because when the other car started following us, she didn't panic. She told me to take the back roads, said she knew a way to lose them, like she'd done it before. The revelation hit Sarah hard. Claire had been running from something, or someone, and it had gotten her killed. But Michael had tried to save her, had carried the guilt and the questions for 15 years without anyone to share the burden. Before she could think better of it, she leaned forward and kissed him. The kiss was soft, tentative, meant to offer comfort rather than passion. But the moment their lips touched, something ignited between them. His left hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone as he deepened the kiss. For a moment, they were just two people who'd found something unexpected in the middle of their shared grief. Then reality crashed back, and they broke apart simultaneously. This is insane, Sarah whispered. Michael's hand was still on her face, his gray eyes dark with emotion she couldn't name. You think I killed her? I think you're the only person who cared enough to remember her. Sarah, don't. She stood up abruptly, backing away from the bench. Don't say whatever you're about to say. This doesn't change anything. I still need to know what happened to her, and you still have information you're not telling me. What makes you think that? Because you haven't asked me a single question about Kane, about who really hired me or why, which means you already know. The accusation hung between them like a challenge, and Sarah saw the exact moment when Michael's walls went back up. Go home, Sarah, he said quietly. Stop looking for your sister. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Sarah spent 2 days trying to track down Richard Kane before she found the first real lead. A receptionist at a downtown law firm recognized the name when Sarah showed her Kane's business card, but not for the reason she expected. Oh, that's not a real person, the woman said, handing the card back. Kane is what we call a placeholder name. Law firms use them for clients who need extra privacy protection. What kind of clients? The kind who can afford to make people disappear from public records. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Can you tell me which firm issued this card? Honey, if someone's using a Kane placeholder, they've paid enough money to make sure you'll never find out who they really are. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment staring at the business card, trying to make sense of the last week. Someone had specifically sought her out, used her connection to Claire to manipulate her into Michael's life, and then vanished the moment she started asking questions. Her phone rang at exactly 9 o'clock. Ms. Mitchell. The voice was smooth, cultured, and completely unfamiliar. I believe it's time we spoke. Who is this? Someone who's been watching your progress with great interest. There's a car waiting outside your building. The driver will bring you to me. Sarah moved to her window and looked down. A black sedan idled at the curb, its windows too tinted to see inside. I'm not getting in a car with strangers. Ms. Mitchell, you've spent 4 days investigating Richard Kane, and I think you've realized by now that you're operating with incomplete information. If you want answers about your sister, about Michael Sterling, about why you were really hired, then you'll get in the car." The line went dead. Sarah stood at the window for 10 minutes, weighing her options. Every instinct told her to call the police, to run, to forget she'd ever heard of Michael Sterling or Richard Kane. Instead, she grabbed her jacket and headed downstairs. The driver was a woman in her 50s who spoke with a slight accent Sarah couldn't identify. She drove in silence through the city, taking a route that led away from Manhattan and into Queens. They stopped at an industrial building that looked abandoned from the outside, but clearly wasn't. Inside, Sarah found herself in what appeared to be a private office complex. Expensive furniture, original artwork, and the kind of hushed atmosphere that suggested serious money changing hands. A man in his 60s, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, waited for her in a conference room overlooking the city. "Ms. Mitchell, thank you for coming. I'm Harrison Thornfield." The name meant nothing to her, but something in his manner suggested it should. He gestured to a chair across from him, and Sarah noticed that a thick file folder sat on the table between them. "Richard Kane doesn't exist," she said without preamble. "No, he doesn't. Richard Kane is a convenience, a way for my organization to conduct business without unnecessary attention." Thornfield opened the file, and Sarah saw photographs of Michael, of herself, of Claire from 15 years ago. "You were hired by the Thornfield organization, Ms. Mitchell. We represent certain interests that prefer to remain private." "What kind of interests?" "The kind that are threatened when people start asking inconvenient questions about events that happened 15 years ago." He slid a photograph across the table. It showed Claire talking to a man Sarah didn't recognize outside what looked like a bank. "Your sister was more resourceful than anyone gave her credit for." Sarah picked up the photo, studying Claire's face. She looked older than 16, more serious, like she was carrying information too heavy for her age. Before she disappeared, Claire Mitchell had gathered evidence of financial irregularities involving several prominent families, including the Sterlings. Money laundering, tax evasion, offshore accounts that existed solely to hide assets from federal authorities. "You're saying Claire was investigating financial crimes?" "I'm saying Claire stumbled onto financial crimes and was smart enough to document what she found." Thornfield pulled out another photograph, this one showing Claire with a manila envelope. She copied bank records, account statements, transaction histories. Everything needed to destroy half a dozen of New York's most powerful families. Sarah's mind raced. And the night she disappeared? The night someone decided she knew too much to be allowed to live. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Michael said another car forced them off the road. Michael Sterling was an unfortunate complication. A teenager who picked up the wrong hitchhiker at the wrong time. Thornfield's expression didn't change. The accident was meant to look like Claire had died in a car crash. Sterling's survival complicated that narrative. "So you've known all along that Claire was murdered?" "We've suspected. But suspicion isn't proof, and proof is what we need to protect our clients' interests." Sarah felt sick. "Your clients? The people Claire had evidence against?" "Some of them, yes. The Thornfield organization exists to manage certain delicate situations for families who prefer to handle their problems privately." "You want me to find out what Michael knows?" "We want you to find out what Claire might have told him before she died. What evidence she might have passed along. What information she might have shared." Thornfield leaned forward slightly. "Michael Sterling has spent 15 years protecting something, Ms. Mitchell. We need to know what it is." The realization hit her like cold water. "You've been watching him all this time." "Of course. A traumatized teenager who survived an accident that was meant to kill both passengers? Someone who refused all medical treatment for 15 years and built walls around himself that no one could penetrate." Thornfield smiled, and it was the coldest expression Sarah had ever seen. "Until you. I won't spy on him. You already have, whether you realized it or not. Every conversation you've had with Sterling, every session, every moment you've spent in his presence has been reported back to us." Sarah felt her world shifting, tilting off its axis. "That's impossible." Thornfield slid one final item across the table. A small recording device, no bigger than a button, sewn into the lining of your medical bag. "You've been transmitting everything since your first session." The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that Sarah couldn't speak. Everything she'd shared with Michael, every vulnerable moment, every breakthrough, had been monitored by people who wanted to destroy him. The good news, Thornfield continued, is that your work is almost finished. Sterling is beginning to trust you, to open up about that night. Soon he'll tell you what we need to know. And if he doesn't know anything, then we'll know that too, and we can finally close this chapter of our history. Thornfield stood up, smoothing his suit jacket. One way or another, Ms. Mitchell, this ends soon. The driver took her home in silence, leaving Sarah alone with the knowledge that she'd been a weapon aimed at the one person who'd tried to help her sister. By the time she reached her apartment, she'd made her decision. She was going to tell Michael everything. Sarah stood outside Michael's building at 6 in the morning, having spent the entire night rehearsing what she needed to say. When the security guard tried to turn her away, she pushed past him and headed straight for the elevator. She found Michael in his kitchen, still in yesterday's clothes, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. He looked up when she entered, and she saw something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Defeat, maybe, or resignation. "I know about Thornfield," she said without preamble. Michael's face didn't change, but his left hand tightened around the coffee mug. "How long?" "Since last night. They had someone pick me up, brought me to meet Harrison Thornfield himself." She pulled the recording device from her pocket and set it on the counter between them. "They've been listening to everything." He stared at the small device for a long moment, then looked back at her. "Everything. Every session, every conversation. They used me to spy on you, and I didn't even know it." Sarah felt tears threaten and forced them back. "Michael, I'm so sorry. Are you?" His voice was quiet, conversational, which somehow made it worse than if he'd shouted. "Or is this just another strategy?" "What?" "Confessing to being a spy, showing me the recording device, apologizing for betraying me. It's exactly what someone would do if they wanted to gain my complete trust before the final push." The accusation hit her like a slap. "You think I'm still working for them?" "I think Harrison Thornfield is the most manipulative man I've ever met, and I think he's been playing a very long game." Michael stood up, moving to the window. "Tell me something, Sarah. When did you first hear about your sister's disappearance?" The question seemed to come from nowhere. "When I was 12. My parents told me she'd run away." "And when did you first decide to become a physical therapist?" Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. "High school, after I learned about rehabilitation medicine. Specifically physical therapy for trauma victims." "Yes, but I don't see what." "When did you first hear about the job treating me?" The questions were coming faster now, and Sarah could see where they were leading. 3 weeks ago, Kane called my clinic directly." Michael turned to face her, and she saw something that might have been pity in his expression. "Sarah, what if I told you that Harrison Thornfield has been watching you your entire life? What if your whole career, your specialization, even your decision to stay in New York, has all been carefully orchestrated to bring you to this moment?" The room seemed to tilt around her. "That's impossible." "Is it?" A 12-year-old girl loses her sister and decides to dedicate her life to helping trauma victims. A girl who just happens to specialize in exactly the type of injury I sustained. A girl who just happens to work at a clinic 3 miles from my apartment. Michael's voice was getting harder with each word. "What are the odds, Sarah?" She sank into a chair, her mind racing. "You're saying they've been manipulating my entire life?" "I'm saying Harrison Thornfield doesn't leave anything to chance." The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that Sarah couldn't process it. Everything she thought she knew about herself, about her choices, about her search for Claire, might have been manufactured by people who saw her as nothing more than a useful tool. "But that doesn't change what happened 15 years ago," she said weakly. "It doesn't change what you know about Claire." Michael was quiet for a long time, studying her face. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its hard edge. "You want to know what really happened that night?" Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "I told you about picking her up, about the other car. What I didn't tell you was what she said before she died. She's dead. She died in my arms, Sarah, about 10 minutes after the accident, while we were both pinned in the car." Michael's voice broke slightly. She was hurt badly, bleeding internally, and she knew she wasn't going to make it. Sarah felt her world collapsing. Claire was really gone. Not missing, not in hiding, but dead for 15 years. "She gave me something," Michael continued. "A safety deposit box key. Made me promise to keep it safe, to never tell anyone about it unless something happened to her family." "Something happened to her family?" "She said there were people who wanted to hurt anyone connected to what she discovered." She made me swear that if anyone ever came looking for her sister, I'd protect that sister the same way I couldn't protect her. The weight of his words settled over Sarah slowly. You've been protecting me. I've been trying to. When Kane contacted you about treating me, I knew Thornfield had found you. When you showed up asking about Claire, I knew they were using you to get to the evidence. What evidence? Michael walked to a wall safe Sarah hadn't noticed before and withdrew a small brass key. 15 years of bank records, transaction histories, and offshore account information that could destroy half the city's power structure. Your sister didn't just stumble onto financial crimes, Sarah. She was systematically documenting them. Why? Because someone she trusted was involved, and she was trying to prove it. Michael held up the key. This is what Thornfield really wants. Not information about what I know, but access to what Claire died protecting. Sarah stared at the key, understanding finally clicking into place. They've been using me to get close to you so they could find that. And now they have. The truth hung between them like a living thing. Sarah had been manipulated, used, turned into a weapon against the one person who'd tried to honor her sister's memory. Michael had spent 15 years carrying the burden of Claire's death and protecting evidence that could get him killed. What do we do now? She whispered. Michael closed his fist around the key. Now we decide whether Claire died for nothing, or whether we finish what she started. The safety deposit box was located in a small, private bank in Lower Manhattan that catered to clients who valued discretion above all else. Michael had visited it only once in 15 years, the day after Claire's funeral, when he deposited the evidence she'd died protecting and sworn never to touch it again. Now, sitting across from Sarah in his apartment with the key between them on the coffee table, he wondered if he'd made the right choice. We can't just walk in there, Sarah said, staring at the brass key. If Thornfield has been watching you for 15 years, he'll know the moment we try to access that box. Which is why we're not going to access it, Michael replied. We're going to use it as bait. Sarah looked up at him, and he saw the fear she was trying to hide. In the last 24 hours, her entire world had been turned upside down. Everything she'd believed about her career, her choices, even her search for her sister, had been revealed as manipulation by people who saw her as nothing more than a useful tool. Bait for what? To draw Thornfield out into the open. To make him show his hand completely. Michael leaned forward, his injured hand resting carefully on his knee. Sarah, your sister didn't just collect financial records. She documented murders. The words hit her like a physical blow. Murders? 3 people who'd tried to expose the same financial network Claire was investigating. All of them died in what appeared to be accidents. Car crashes, drownings, a gas leak explosion. Claire had found connections between all of them and the Thornfield organization. Sarah felt sick. How many people has he killed? More than we'll ever know. But if we can get him to admit to Claire's murder, if we can record him confessing to ordering that accident, we might be able to stop him. And how exactly do we do that? Michael pulled out his phone and showed her a contact number. We call him and tell him we're ready to make a deal. Before Sarah could respond, her own phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but somehow she knew who it was before she answered. Ms. Mitchell. Harrison Thornfield's cultured voice filled the quiet apartment. I trust you've had an illuminating conversation with Mr. Sterling. Michael motioned for her to put the call on speaker. What do you want? Sarah asked. I want what I've always wanted. The contents of safety deposit box 247 at Meridian Private Banking. Your sister was quite thorough in her documentation, and it's time for that documentation to disappear. And if we refuse? Thornfield's laugh was cold, calculating. Then you'll both suffer unfortunate accidents, just like Claire did. The difference is, I won't make the mistake of leaving survivors this time. Sarah felt Michael tense beside her, saw his left hand curl into a fist. You killed her, Michael said, his voice deadly quiet. I killed a teenage girl who was threatening to destroy some very important people. Just as I'll kill both of you if you continue to be a problem. Thornfield's tone remained conversational, as if he were discussing the weather. The beauty of it, Mr. Sterling, is that everyone will understand why you finally snapped. 15 years of guilt over that poor girl's death, the pressure of running a business empire, the stress of your recent injury. It's quite tragic, really. What about Sarah? Oh, Ms. Mitchell will die trying to help you, of course. A dedicated therapist who got too close to her patient tried to stop him from harming himself. Very heroic, very believable. Sarah found her voice. You're insane. I'm practical. The Thornfield organization has protected its clients for over 50 years. We've weathered investigations, congressional hearings, federal task forces. We're not going to be brought down by a dead 16-year-old and her misguided sister. Michael stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his entire body radiating tension. Sarah could see the struggle playing out across his features, the weight of carrying Claire's secret for 15 years finally becoming too much to bear. There's something else, Michael said, turning back to face the phone. Something Claire told me before she died that you need to know. Sarah heard the change in his voice, saw the subtle shift in his posture, and realized he was improvising, trying to draw Thornfield deeper into the conversation. I'm listening, Thornfield said. She didn't just document the financial crimes. She had a partner, someone on the inside who was feeding her information. Michael's voice was steady, convincing. Someone in your organization who wanted out. The silence stretched for long seconds. When Thornfield spoke again, his voice had lost its calm professionalism. That's impossible. We've accounted for every member of the organization from that time period. Have you? Because Claire mentioned a name before she died. Someone she trusted, someone who'd been helping her gather evidence for months. Sarah watched Michael's face, marveling at his ability to lie so convincingly while building a trap for the man who'd killed her sister. What name? Thornfield demanded. I think that information is worth more than just our lives, don't you? Maybe it's worth a trade. You're in no position to negotiate, aren't I? Because if something happens to us, that name goes to the FBI along with copies of everything in that safety deposit box. But if you're willing to discuss terms. Michael let the sentence hang, and Sarah could almost hear Thornfield's mind working through the implications. 1 hour, Thornfield said finally. Meridian Private Banking. You bring the key, I'll bring assurances of your continued good health. And if it's a trap, then you'll discover that the price of betrayal is always higher than people expect. The line went dead, leaving them in silence. Sarah stared at Michael, trying to process what had just happened. There is no partner, she said. No, but Thornfield doesn't know that. Michael sat back down, and she could see the exhaustion in his face. He spent 15 years believing he'd eliminated all the threats to his organization. The possibility that someone on the inside betrayed him will eat at him. So we're really going to meet him. We're going to end this, one way or another. Sarah studied his expression, seeing something she hadn't noticed before. The careful way he held his right hand, the slight tremor in his fingers, the unconscious protective gesture whenever he was stressed. Michael, what really happened to your hand that night? He looked down at his injured hand, and she saw 15 years of pain and guilt in that simple gesture. The metal that went through my wrist wasn't from the accident, he said quietly. After the crash, when I was pinned under the steering wheel, I could hear Claire breathing. She was alive, but the car was starting to smoke. I knew we didn't have much time. Sarah felt her heart clench. There was a piece of rebar from the guardrail, driven through the dashboard and into my wrist. I had to pull it out to get free, to try to help her. His voice broke slightly. I destroyed the nerves in my hand getting out of that car, and by the time I reached her, she was already dying. You gave up the use of your hand trying to save her. I gave up everything trying to save her, and it wasn't enough. Sarah reached for him then, covering his injured hand with both of hers. The contact was gentle, careful, but she felt him tremble at her touch. She didn't die alone, Sarah whispered. Because of you, she didn't die alone. For a moment, they sat in silence, connected by touch and shared grief. Then Michael's phone buzzed with a text message, and reality crashed back around them. Thornfield, he said, reading the message. He wants to move the meeting. Says Meridian Banking isn't private enough. Sarah felt fear settle cold in her stomach. Where does he want to meet? Michael showed her the address, and she recognized it immediately. The same industrial building in Queens where she'd met Thornfield the night before. It's a trap, she said. Of course it's a trap, but it's the only chance we have to end this. Michael, if we go there, we're not coming back. He stood up and walked to his safe, removing something Sarah hadn't seen before. A small digital recorder, the kind lawyers used for depositions. Maybe not, he said, but at least we'll take him with us. Sarah stared at the recorder, understanding finally dawning. You want him to confess. I want him to tell the truth about Claire, about the murders, about everything. and I want it recorded. And then what? Even if we get a confession, how do we get it to the authorities if we're dead? Michael smiled then, and it was the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. Because, Sarah, you're not going to that meeting. You're going to the FBI. What? No, I'm not leaving you to face him alone. You're the only one who can finish what Claire started. You're the only one who can make sure her death meant something. The argument that followed was fierce, desperate, and ultimately futile. Michael had made his decision, and nothing Sarah said could change his mind. He was going to face Harrison Thornfield alone, armed with nothing but a recording device and 15 years of accumulated guilt and rage. As evening approached and the time for the meeting drew near, Sarah realized she was about to lose the second person she'd ever loved to the same monster who'd killed her sister. And this time, she was powerless to stop it. Sarah spent 20 minutes in the FBI field office in Federal Plaza before anyone would take her seriously. The recording device Michael had given her, along with copies of Claire's evidence from the safety deposit box, finally convinced Agent Rebecca Martinez to listen to her story. You're telling me that Harrison Thornfield has been orchestrating murders for 15 years, and your boyfriend is meeting him alone right now? Martinez asked, studying the documents spread across her desk. He's not my boyfriend, Sarah said automatically, then realized how ridiculous that sounded given the circumstances. Agent Martinez, Michael is walking into a trap. Thornfield admitted to killing my sister, and he's planning to kill both of us tonight. Martinez was already reaching for her phone. Where's this meeting supposed to take place? Sarah gave her the address in Queens, watching as Martinez coordinated with tactical teams and other agents. Within minutes, the FBI field office had transformed into a command center focused on taking down the Thornfield organization. Ms. Mitchell, I need you to understand something, Martinez said as they prepared to leave for Queens. If Sterling is already at that location, we might be too late to help him. Sarah felt her heart clench, but she forced herself to think practically. Michael is smart. He'll find a way to stay alive long enough for you to get there. She hoped she was right. Meanwhile, across the city, Michael stood outside the industrial building in Queens, checking his watch. He was 30 minutes early, which gave him time to study the building's layout and plan his approach. The recording device was taped to his chest, hidden beneath his shirt, and he'd tested it twice to make sure it was working. His right hand was trembling more than usual, the stress and adrenaline exacerbating the nerve damage. He flexed his fingers carefully, trying to maintain what mobility he had. If this went badly, he'd need every advantage he could get. The building's lobby was empty except for a security guard who directed him to the elevator. On the third floor, he found Harrison Thornfield waiting in the same conference room where Sarah had met him the night before. Mr. Sterling, punctual as always. Thornfield gestured to a chair across from him. Please sit. Michael remained standing. Where's the key? Safe. As are you, for the moment. Thornfield opened a laptop and turned it toward Michael. On the screen was a live video feed of Sarah entering the FBI building. Your girlfriend made an interesting choice tonight. Michael felt his blood turn to ice. You're watching her. I'm watching everyone, Mr. Sterling. It's how I've stayed alive in this business for 30 years. Thornfield closed the laptop with a soft click. Ms. Mitchell is currently meeting with Agent Rebecca Martinez, presumably to share your sister's evidence and that touching recording of our earlier conversation. Then you know it's over. Do I? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like the FBI is about to raid an empty building while the real Harrison Thornfield disappears into a very comfortable retirement. Thornfield smiled, and Michael realized he'd been outplayed. Did you really think I'd conduct this meeting in a location I couldn't abandon at a moment's notice? Michael's mind raced. If this wasn't Thornfield's real base of operations, if the FBI was raiding the wrong location, then Sarah had walked into federal custody with evidence that might not be enough to convict anyone. What do you want? Michael asked. I want you to understand that your heroic gesture has accomplished nothing except ensuring that more people will die. Ms. Mitchell, Agent Martinez, probably a few other federal agents who get too close to the truth. Thornfield stood up and walked to the window. I want you to know that as you die tonight. And Claire, do you want me to know why you killed a 16-year-old girl? Thornfield turned back to him, and Michael saw something cold and calculating in his expression. Your precious Claire wasn't just investigating financial crimes, Mr. Sterling. She was my daughter. The revelation hit Michael like a physical blow. What? Claire Mitchell was born Claire Thornfield, adopted at birth by a lovely couple who had no idea they were raising the child of a man they'd never heard of. Thornfield's voice carried a mixture of pride and regret. She was brilliant, resourceful, and unfortunately developed a moral compass that put her directly at odds with the family business. Michael felt his world shifting. You killed your own daughter. I killed a threat to my organization. The fact that she shared my DNA was irrelevant. Thornfield pulled a gun from his jacket, holding it casually but with obvious familiarity. Just as your connection to Sarah Mitchell is irrelevant now. What connection? Did you really think it was coincidence that brought you together? Sarah Mitchell isn't just Claire's sister, Mr. Sterling. She's Claire's twin sister. Separated at birth, adopted by different families, raised to serve different purposes. Thornfield's smile was coldly satisfied. I've been watching both my daughters their entire lives. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Sarah's dedication to trauma therapy, her specialization in exactly the type of injury Michael had sustained, her presence in New York despite having no family ties to the city. None of it had been coincidence. You manipulated her entire life. I guided her toward her destiny. Claire was meant to be my successor, to take over the organization when I retired. When she proved unsuitable, Sarah became the contingency plan. Thornfield raised the gun slightly. Unfortunately, both my daughters developed inconvenient attachments to people they should have been using. Michael thought about Sarah, about the way she'd touched his hand so carefully during their sessions, about the kiss by the reservoir that had changed everything between them. She doesn't know. Of course she doesn't know. Sarah believes she's an orphan who dedicated her life to helping people. It's quite touching, really. Thornfield's finger moved to the trigger. She'll learn the truth eventually, assuming she survives what's coming next. Which is, Agent Martinez is about to discover that the evidence she's examining is fabricated, that the recording device you're wearing is transmitting false information, that Sarah Mitchell has been manipulating the investigation from the beginning. Thornfield's expression didn't change. By tomorrow morning, Sarah will be in federal custody, charged with obstruction of justice and conspiracy to commit fraud. Michael felt rage building in his chest, the same protective fury he'd felt 15 years ago when he'd tried to save Claire. His right hand clenched involuntarily, and for the first time in years, his fingers closed completely into a fist. You won't hurt her, he said. I won't have to. The federal prison system will do that for me. Michael moved before Thornfield could react, his injured hand proving more functional than anyone had expected. The gun went off as they struggled, the bullet embedding in the wall behind where Michael had been standing. They crashed into the conference table, papers and laptops scattering across the floor. Despite 15 years of limited mobility, Michael's hand proved strong enough to grip Thornfield's wrist and prevent him from aiming the weapon. They fought desperately, silently, each man understanding that only one of them would leave the room alive. The door burst open as FBI agents flooded into the building. Agent Martinez appeared in the doorway with her weapon drawn, taking in the scene in a split second. "Drop the weapon," she shouted. Thornfield tried to comply, but Michael's grip on his wrist was too strong. In the confusion, the gun discharged again, and Thornfield went limp. Michael released him and stepped back, breathing hard. His right hand was shaking, but it had worked when he needed it most. After 15 years of believing he'd lost everything in that car accident, he'd discovered that some things were worth fighting for with whatever strength remained. "Is he dead?" Michael asked. Martinez knelt beside Thornfield, checking for a pulse. "No, but he's going to wish he was when he wakes up in federal custody." Later, in the FBI field office, Sarah threw her arms around Michael with enough force to nearly knock him over. He caught her with both hands, his right arm functioning better than it had in years. "I thought you were dead," she whispered against his chest. "I thought you were going to prison," he replied, holding her tightly. Agent Martinez approached them with a stack of documents. "Ms. Mitchell, we're going to need full statements from both of you, but I wanted you to know that the evidence you provided has already led to 17 arrests. The Thornfield organization is finished." Sarah looked up at Michael, and he saw something in her expression that made his heart race. "What happens now?" "Now we figure out how to live without looking over our shoulders," he said. "How to be normal people who fall in love and get married and argue about what to watch on television." "Married?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Eventually." If you can stand being married to someone who spent 15 years carrying your sister's secrets and nearly got you killed in the process. Sarah reached up and touched his face gently, the same way she'd touched his hand during their first session. I can stand it, but only if you promise to let me continue your physical therapy. Michael smiled, flexing his right hand and marveling at the improved range of motion. I think I'm going to need long-term treatment. Good, Sarah said, because I intend to spend the rest of my life healing you. 6 months later, they were married in a small ceremony in Central Park, with Agent Martinez as Sarah's maid of honor and James Crawford, Michael's former head of security, serving as best man. Michael's hand had regained nearly full function through intensive therapy and, as Sarah insisted, the healing power of being touched by someone who loved him completely. They honeymooned in a small town in Vermont where no one knew their names or their story, where they could walk hand in hand without wondering if they were being watched. On their last night, sitting by a lake that reflected the stars, Sarah took his right hand in both of hers. "Does it hurt anymore?" she asked. Michael looked down at their intertwined fingers, at the wedding ring that gleamed gold in the moonlight. "No," he said, "it doesn't hurt anymore." For the first time in 15 years, that was completely true. He had been cold, rich, and alone, until she touched his hand. 2 years later, Sarah Sterling stood in the kitchen of their new house in Westchester, watching her husband attempt to flip pancakes with his right hand. The scar on his wrist had faded to a thin silver line, barely visible unless you knew where to look. "Show off," she said, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. Michael laughed, a sound that had become wonderfully common in their home. 2 years of marriage, and you're still impressed by basic motor skills. I'm impressed by you. He turned in her arms, and she marveled at how much he'd changed since that first day in his sterile apartment. The cold, guarded man who'd refused her touch had been replaced by someone who reached for her hand automatically, who pulled her close while they watched movies, who traced patterns on her skin while she fell asleep. Agent Martinez called, Michael said, nodding towards Sarah's phone on the counter. "The last of Thornfield's associates took a plea deal yesterday. It's really over." Sarah felt a familiar flutter of relief. Even after 2 years, part of her still expected to find men in dark suits watching their house, waiting for some loose end from the past to unravel their happiness. "Good," she said. "Now we can focus on more important things." "Like what?" Sarah smiled and placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "Like getting ready to be parents." Michael's expression shifted from confusion to wonder to pure joy in the space of a heartbeat. His right hand, the hand that had been damaged trying to save her sister, pressed gently against where their child was growing. "How long have you known?" he whispered. 3 days. I wanted to be sure before I told you." Michael kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promises. When they broke apart, he kept his hand on her stomach, as if he could already feel the life they'd created together. "Claire would have loved this," Sarah said quietly. "She would have loved you," Michael replied. "Both of you." That evening, they sat together on their back porch, Sarah's head on Michael's shoulder while he absently stroked her hair with his right hand. The gesture was unconscious, natural, the kind of simple intimacy that had taken him years to accept and now couldn't imagine living without. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" Sarah asked. "Every day," Michael said. "But then I remember that all of it, the pain and the secrets, and even Thornfield, led me to you." Sarah lifted her head to look at him. "No regrets." Michael brought his right hand to her face, cupping her cheek with fingers that moved freely, without pain, guided by a heart that had finally learned to heal. Only that it took us so long to find each other. Above them, the stars reflected off the windows of their home, and for the first time in either of their lives, the future stretched ahead bright and unafraid. Some stories end with justice. Some end with revenge. Theirs ended with love.